the homecoming. It had been 500 years since Abraham first heard the promise, and for all those generations it had remained just words, like seeds long dormant in the ground. For the past 40 years they had been living as nomads in no man's land, anticipating the day when they would walk onto promised soil. Now, finally, the day had come. Every place you set your foot will be yours, God assured Joshua as the mantle of leadership settled on his shoulders. But Joshua was terrified. Don't be fearful or discouraged. Be strong and audacious, for I will be right there with you. The book of the law will be your handbook, and it will show you how to be successful. A couple of strong swimmers crossed the river one night, and the next morning the two spies walked bold as brass through the main gates of Jericho. The city was in no imminent danger of being attacked. The swollen river would see to that for the immediate future, so no one challenged Salmon and his buddy. But that didn't mean their arrival had gone unnoticed. Two strangers wandering around the city were unlikely to escape the attention of local eyes everywhere they went. But neither was a pretty young woman likely to escape the attention of two Israeli men. They followed her home, doubtless with the intention of checking out local culture, and they were delighted when she invited them in. It gradually dawned on them that their hostess was a professional at that game, who had spotted them long before they had noticed her. Your presence in Jericho is no secret, you know, fellas. I'm betting the police are on their way even now as we speak. A pounding on the door confirmed her words. So the game was up before it had even started. Quick, she hissed. Up here! She led the way up to the flat roof, where she was drying flax. Now lie flat! Before they could protest, she'd buried them under bundles of stalks. They heard her retreating footsteps as she ran down the stairs to open the door. Would she betray them? They had no choice but to wait and see. They heard distant, muffled voices filtering up through the stems, but then there was silence. They waited for what seemed like a long time, and then she was back. It's safe to come out now, she said, shifting the flax. I told them that you had paid me a quick visit, and then took off who knows where. Well, that was an easy story to believe. Men didn't usually stay long in the prostitute's house. Now you fellas listen up, she said earnestly as she set food and drink before them. I have no doubt that God is going to give you this whole land. We may have our local idols, but your God is God of heaven and earth. I want you to swear that neither I nor my family will suffer any harm when you come back with your army to capture this city. Swear it, and I will help you escape. Fair enough, they agreed. But when we come back, be sure that all your family is here with you in your house. And clearly display this scarlet cord in the window that faces out over the wall of the city, so that we'll recognize and respect your house. Oh, and what's your name, by the way? My name is Rahab. They shook on the agreement, and there may have been the beginnings of a romantic attachment, for when the subsequent battle was all done, Salmon would return to make her his wife. Her house being built right into the city wall, Rahab let them climb down a rope to freedom. When they made it back to Joshua, they were able to bring the encouraging report that the people whose cities were so well fortified and forbidding were in reality as terrified as children. So next day they moved the entire camp to the brink of the Jordan. The river was swollen by spring rains, spilling over its banks. The question that was in everyone's mind was how they could get across the churning maelstrom of foaming water. Nevertheless, very early in the morning, a couple of days later, they struck camp. The Levites carrying the Ark of the Covenant were at the head of the column. Undeterred by the current plucking at their legs, they waded straight into the river. Sheer madness. Any moment they and the ark would be swept away and the whole advance ignominiously stopped before it started. But for some inexplicable reason, the water got no deeper. No matter how far the Levites walked into the river, the water remained ankle-deep. The raging current ceased to rage. It dwindled to a stream, then a trickle, and puddled into pools, and finally was as dry as a creek bed in summer. The Levites stood dry-shod in the middle of the riverbed, and the whole nation crossed over. They were led by an army of 40,000 drawn from the men of the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh, exactly as agreed. Now, for the first time since Jacob had left for Egypt 450 years previously, the children of Israel stood on the land of promise. When they were all safe across, 12 men, one from each tribe, were ordered to go back down into the riverbed to pick up 12 boulders. The last to leave the river were the Levites carrying the ark, and the very moment they set foot on dry ground, the waters of the river resumed their flood levels, cutting off their line of retreat. They had arrived. They were committed. There was no turning back. This was it. That evening, as they settled into their new base camp, they built a cairn with the boulders from the riverbed, so that if any subsequent generation should ever forget their grand entrance to the land of promise, the stones would serve as a reminder. The place became known as Gilgal. That night, God spoke to Joshua. He reminded him that the sign of the covenant to which Abraham had agreed 600 years before had been ignored. For the past 40 years, no one had been circumcised. Here they were, out on a limb, totally dependent upon God's miraculous intervention. And if ever circumcision had significance, then surely this was it. Next day, all the men were circumcised. This is madness, they must have thought, as the following week the entire army was in too much discomfort so much as to sneeze. "We're totally at the mercy of our enemies." "Not so," said Joshua and Caleb, the only two healthy males in the camp. "We are, as always, at the mercy of God, by whose grace we are this day as numberless as the grains of sand beneath our feet." Their arrival in the land of promise coincided with the 40th anniversary of the night that the destroying angel had passed over their homes in Egypt while killing the Egyptian firstborn. So, as the army was in no fit state to do much else, they celebrated the Passover. The land of milk and honey also offered an abundant supply of fruit and vegetables. For the first time in 40 years, the Israelis enjoyed a change of diet. And that was the last day that manna was ever seen. Joshua was still working on his self-confidence, transitioning from his role as second fiddle to Moses to fearless leader. Repeatedly in those early days, God had urged him to be strong and courageous, reassuring him that he would never be far away. Joshua went out one night on his own to reconnoiter his first big challenge, Jericho, the fortress city. The indestructible walls stood black and menacing against the starry sky. How could they ever get in there? He'd seen those walls 40 years before and had done his best then to reassure his fellow spies that their threat was but an illusion. But now they seemed very real. And were there really giants crouching in the darkness? Suddenly a slight movement caught his eye. Someone was standing but a few paces away, tall and terrifying. "Declare yourself," barked General Joshua, hiding his fear behind military brusqueness. "Are you for us or for our enemies?" "Neither," was the unexpected reply. "I am the commander of the Lord's armies." Joshua buckled at the knees and fell face down. "What are your orders, sir?" he stammered. "You can start by removing your boots, for this is holy ground." "Fear God, and you will then have nothing else to fear." Felt like a good line for a song. That dark night of reckless, daring confidence was born in Joshua. "Be strong and courageous, for God will be with you wherever you go." Jericho? Push over. The instructions that the commander gave to Joshua were unusual, to say the least. Siege works were not to be an option. Have the men march around the city once a day for 6 days. No talking, but blow the bugles continuously. Take the ark with you, carried by the priests. On the 7th day, it'll be 7 circuits. When you take the city, burn it. Slaughter the inhabitants. Everything that breathes must die. Everything that burns must burn. The gold, silver, and bronze, however, are to be gathered as an offering to the Lord. In future, men can keep what plunder they find, but this is the first conquest, and the loot is firstfruits to the Lord. So it fell out. Jericho residents were nonplussed. The disciplined silence of the marching men contrasted to the menacing wail of the bugles. The tramping boots seemed to shake the foundations of their security. After a week of this, the residents of Jericho were beginning to relax when the routine changed. After the first time round, the soldiers just kept going. By the seventh circuit, the city was completely encircled by silent, marching men. Then the bugles changed their tune to one long scream, and a nerve-jarring war cry rose from the men. Ornaments rattled on the shelves, pictures fell from the walls, the ground rumbled deep down, and masonry began to fall from the ceilings. Then everything broke loose, the roof caved in, the noise of falling stones, screams of terrified people, the smoke of fire and the dust of destruction. To the Israeli army outside on the perimeter road that encircled the walls, the sight was awe-inspiring. One minute the walls stood strong and defiant, and the next they became blurred, indistinct as they crumbled to rubble and dust. Jericho's protection really was an illusion. The only section of the wall that remained intact had a length of scarlet cord dangling incongruously from a small window. Then every Israeli found himself in the front row of the advance, from all sides at once. There was no resistance. Everything that breathed, breathed no more. Everything that could burn, burnt. In the turmoil of the battle, disoriented by the horror of it all, the stench of death, the dust of destruction, one Israeli lost his sense of perspective. Achan was ransacking a fine house in what must have been an upmarket district of town. The resident family, whom he found huddled in a corner, were all bloody corpses, and the house was beginning to burn nicely. Then, through the smoke, there before Achan was the safe, open, spilling out a fortune of silver and gold, enough to set him and his family up for life. No one was there to see, and surely God wouldn't miss a handful of cash. And in any case, in the context of such violent horror, what did a few less coins in the offering amount to? So he grabbed the loot, wrapped it up in a fine-looking cloak, and hurried back to his tent before anyone would notice. That night there were celebrations. What they had feared for 40 years had turned out to be a cakewalk. A handful of scrapes and bruises, but no real casualties to talk of. So what was the next step? Joshua resolved to drive a wedge into the middle of the land by heading up into the mountains directly west of Jericho. This would discourage any further united resistance. There was a town named Ai, a name that implied that the place already was a ruin, so without so much as a by your leave from the commander-in-chief of the armies of the Lord, Joshua sent spies to reconnoiter. Celebrations were still going on when they returned. It seemed that Ai was indeed a bit of a dump, but a fortified dump nevertheless. But compared to Jericho's defences, a good sneeze should take care of them walls. No need to stop the party. Just send a couple of thousand of the lads up there. They should be home by supper time. To be on the safe side, 3,000 men went. And they were indeed back that same evening, but bleeding and dispirited. And when they called the roll, 36 men were missing. Fear spread through the camp like dysentery. Clothes were torn in frustration and dust flung into the air. "So what about this, God?" Joshua accused, pounding his fists on the ground. "If only we'd been content to stay in the wilderness on t'other side of Jordan. Work of this defeat will get out, you know, and your name's going to be mud. The natives will join forces and wipe us out of existence, and that's not going to do your reputation any good neither." "Get up and stand at attention when I'm talking to you," God replied. "There's sin in the camp. One of your men has taken home something that I said must be destroyed. So now your whole army is in jeopardy till he and his family are no more." God gave instructions on how the guilty party was to be identified. Next day, everyone was called out on parade. An impressive sight, 12 squares with banners for each tribe. Achan was not pleased to be dragged from the warmth of his bed so early in the morning. His head ached from the celebrations of the previous night. After all, he had more to celebrate than anyone else. He was rich, and nobody knew it. He took his place amongst the ranks of Judah. Joshua was explaining that there was sin in the camp and that it was necessary to identify the culprit. No fear of his being singled out from a lineup of over 1 million. But it was annoying that the other 11 tribes were quickly dismissed, leaving Judah alone to face the accusing eyes of the general. No one went back to his tent. Everyone hung around to see what would happen. People have always enjoyed a whodunit. Achan was still but 1 in 100,000. No immediate cause for concern. The tribe was organized along family lines, clans, families, and households. The Zerahite clan was next identified. For the first time, Achan felt a twinge of disquiet, one that broke into a cold sweat when Zimri was chosen. Zimri was Achan's grandfather. From there it was inevitable. Carmi, Achan's dad, was singled out, and finally from among his brothers, Achan. So there he stood, with 1,000,000 accusing pairs of eyes on him. "What have you done?" Joshua asked. Well, there was no sense in hiding it. "You find some gold and silver, and clothing hidden under the ground sheet in my tent." Half an hour later, there it all was, in a pathetic little heap on a rock. Achan stood shamefaced. Set for life, was he? The whole army joined in stoning him and his family. Destruction. Then they burned the corpses and heaped stones over the ashes. Trouble. The Valley of Trouble, that terrible place was forever called. Morale was low. "Don't be discouraged," God commanded Joshua once again, as he gave him specific instructions on how Ai was to be taken. This time, the men can keep the plunder for themselves. There was no marching round the city, no bugles blaring, just cunning. A company of men snuck round the back of the city and hid in a ravine. Joshua marched the main army in a full frontal attack on the city gates, and then, feigning defeat, fled in apparent disarray. The king of Ai led his entire defending force in delighted pursuit, unaware that a hostile force was sneaking out of the bushes and in through the still wide-open gates. It may have been the smell of smoke that finally got their attention, but too late. They were trapped, nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. No one escaped. The last to die was the king himself, hanging from a tree. A few days later, a disheveled group of travelers wandered into the Israeli camp at Gilgal. Apparently they'd come from a distant land to make a treaty with Israel. Apologizing for their appearance, they insisted that when they'd left home, their clothes and provisions had been fresh. "Travel is a curse," they explained, showing their mouldy provisions. Flattered by the thought that distant lands had not only heard of them, but actually wanted to make friends, Joshua shook hands and signed a treaty. He might have been smart to have asked God first, because 3 days later the truth came out. The travelers came from Gibeon, a city just south of Ai. "Kill them!" someone shouted. "Not so," said Joshua. "We can't break our word." "But they lied to us." "If we want God's favour, we must be trustworthy, just as he is. But," perhaps as an afterthought, "I suppose there's no harm in using them as slave labour." The capitulation of Gibeon disturbed the king of Jerusalem, a nearby neighbour a mile or so to the south. King is perhaps an exaggeration, for Adoni-Zedek was little more than a town mayor. But to say that he was a king sounded more impressive. What troubled him was that Gibeon was a sizable city with a fierce reputation for being mighty warriors. If Gibeon had gone under, what hope for the rest of them? So Adoni-Zedek shared his concerns with some of his cronies, and 4 other kings from neighbouring cities in the southern half of the land united their fighting men to form a formidable army. They marched on Gibeon, bent on destroying the turncoats. A runner was dispatched from Gibeon to Joshua in Gilgal to beg for help from their new allies. It would have been so easy for Israel to do nothing, simply allow Adoni-Zedek to do what their oath had prevented them from doing. But as it turned out, this was a divine appointment that would save Israel a lot of time and trouble, one big battle being much more efficient than a string of small ones. God gave the operation the thumbs up, and the Israelis marched all night up the ragged trail from the Jordan Valley to Gibeon, high in the mountains between the ruins of Ai and Jerusalem. Adoni-Zedek and his allies were caught completely by surprise. Panic threw them into confusion. Many died, but even more fled south towards home. The skies turned black, and hail the size of goose eggs added to the slaughter. The 5 kings sought refuge in a cave, a short-lived reprieve, since someone saw them go in and kept them there, prisoners on death row, till the executioner would arrive. The day wore thin, and it looked like many of the allied soldiers would escape under the cloak of darkness. "Let the time stand still!" Joshua cried out in a thunderous voice. And the sun stayed where it was till the killing was all done. Daylight saving. That decisive battle secured the southern half of the land. The hill country, the Negev, the western foothills, and the mountain slopes. There was some mopping up still to do, pockets of resistance, but that was all part of the process of taking possession of the territory, securing and settling the towns and garrisons. One might imagine that the kings of the northern territory should have learned by the mistakes of their southern neighbours, yet not one of them suggested peace talks or negotiations. It was King Jabin of Hazor, capital city of the north, who took the initiative. He rallied the support of a plethora of kings from far and wide, Lebanon, South Galilee, the great city to beyond the Jordan. They arrived at a secret rendezvous high up in the mountains, just west of Hazor. Their army covered the mountain slopes like trees in the forest. The commanders of the cavalry didn't think much of the location, complaining that their horses and chariots would be useless in the steep terrain. But doubtless their fears were calmed with the promises that this was just to be their meeting place, and battle would not be joined till they were well positioned on the flatter ground near Hazor. But a secret meeting place, when attended by hundreds of thousands of noisy soldiers hauling heavy equipment, quickly ceases to be a secret meeting place. Joshua had scouts in the mountains looking down on the northern allies. "They have horses and chariots," they reported breathlessly to Joshua. "Some trust in chariots and some trust in horses, but we trust in the name of our God," Joshua replied calmly, mindful of the time that he and his fellow spies had reported to Moses what they had first seen in the land 40 years back. "Don't be afraid of them," the Lord assured Joshua. "By this time tomorrow they'll all be dead." And so it turned out. The Israelis mounted a surprise attack before Jabin and his allies were organized. Thousands were killed in the confusion. The rest fled north, up through the mountains, desperately trying to stay alive. Their relentless pursuers hacked them down all the way up into the snows of the Lebanon mountains. "Let's keep the horses and the chariots. They could be useful," someone suggested. But Joshua did as God had told him, hamstrung the horses, and used the chariots for firewood. All that remained in that region was to take possession of the towns. They made an example of Hazor and burned it to the ground. But there was no sense in unnecessary destruction, so other cities were kept intact. But that's more than can be said for the population. Every man, woman, and child was mercilessly slaughtered. So the Promised Land was under Israeli control. That's not to say that there were no survivors. There were groups hidden away in remote, inaccessible areas, notably the Philistines, comparatively recent immigrant invaders from the island of Crete. They hung on for generations. What followed might have been contentious, the dividing up of the turf between the tribes. Only the Levites would get no specific territory, since they were set apart to be scattered throughout the land to minister to the spiritual needs of the other 11 tribes. Negotiations might have been heated. Who would get the waterfront lots along the Mediterranean coast? Who would have the fertile Jordan Valley? They agreed to leave the allocation to God, and when they divided up the map into unequal parcels, they rolled the dice, trusting God to let the lines fall where he chose. Caleb, Joshua's fellow spy from way back, now 85, insisted that Hebron was his inheritance. "Moses promised me that land. Whatever do you want that place for? It's steep terrain. Hebron's a heavily fortified city, garrisoned by giants." "But that's the point," Caleb insisted. "It was giants, impregnable fortifications, and impossible terrain that made the people fear. when our fellow spies brought them a negative report. I want to prove them wrong. But you're an old man. I'm still as strong and fit as ever I was. Besides, I want the next generation to learn to carry on the family tradition. So the old men led the attack on Hebron, killing off the defending giants and securing not only the city, but the traditional family tomb where Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were buried, the cave of Machpelah. The fortress of Debir was further up in the hills, and doubtless Caleb could have done the job himself. But instead he involved the next generation. Whoever takes Debir gets my daughter Exa as a prize. Othniel, Caleb's nephew, had long loved his cousin, so he won the prize. When the wedding gifts were being opened, there were the title deeds to Debir and a huge chunk of desert real estate to go with it. Well, thanks, Dad, said Exa, but desert land is fine, but it's of no value without water. So Caleb extended the property lines to include the upper and the lower springs. However, other members of the same tribe of Judah were not so successful. Jerusalem was an impregnable fortress, perched on the top of inaccessible cliffs. A group of stubborn and determined Jebusites hunkered down there and stayed put. Forget it, the Israelis conceded. And they did forget it for 4 centuries. Ephraim and Manasseh, being prolific breeders, had multiplied more than the average, so they demanded more land. That's fine, Joshua agreed, but you have to take and clear it yourselves. This was no simple task, since the valleys were defended by warlike Canaanites with state-of-the-art iron chariots, and the dense forests were inhabited by fierce mountain people. But they rose to the challenge, and it was there where the mountains gave way to the plains in the west that Joshua himself settled in a town named Timnath-Serah. Throughout the country, certain cities were designated cities of refuge. These were safe houses to which people guilty of manslaughter could run for protection, safe from the vengeful relatives of their accidental victims. Also scattered throughout the tribes were 48 cities, which, together with the surrounding farmland, became the homes of the tribe of Levi. That way they would be on hand to care for the spiritual needs of the whole nation, exercising their ministry in every corner of the land. So there they were, home and dry. The land was taken. The people were settled in their new homes. The promises of God had proved true. Joshua summoned the leaders of the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh. You fellows have been as good as your word. You promised Moses on the day that he allocated you territory east of Jordan that you wouldn't stay home, but would lead the attack into the land of promise. Mission accomplished. So you're now free to return home and join your families. So they set off with vast herds and truckloads of booty. When they reached the Jordan River, which separated their lands from those of their brother tribes, they paused to build a replica of the altar of the Lord, which was in the tabernacle back in Shiloh. This will serve to remind our kids where our spiritual roots are. And perhaps it'll also remind our fellow Israelis that we're still part of the family. Separated by the river, yes, but united under God. Good intentions can sometimes be misunderstood. Rumours flashed round the land. Those guys from the tribe of Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh have turned traitor. No sooner are they over the Jordan than they've started a new religion. Built a pagan altar to God knows who. Get your swords! Mercifully, cool heads prevailed, and a delegation of leaders preceded the angry mob. Understanding dawned, peace restored. Some years later, Joshua called a national assembly at Shechem. Hundreds of thousands arrived in the valley where Abraham had first pitched his tent on promised soil 700 years earlier. 6 tribes stood on the arid slopes of Mount Ebal, while the other 6 massed on the fertile side of Mount Gerizim. There in the valley between them was scattered a mound of moss-covered stones that Abraham himself had gathered as his first altar to God. And by it wound a stream that had dried up during that hot summer, forcing Abraham to migrate further south to Egypt. There was the well that Jacob had dug a couple of generations later as a precaution against drought. And there was the ancient oak tree whose roots hid the guilty secret of the murderous sons of Jacob, whose names their tribes still bore. This valley was the land promised to Joseph by his father Jacob many generations back, down in Egypt. The first item on the agenda for the National Assembly was therefore a funeral. For the past 50 years, they'd been hauling with them a 400-year-old mummy, the remains of Joseph. And there he was finally laid to rest, and with him were buried the last vestiges of their years of slavery. Next, Joshua supervised the reconstruction of Abraham's altar, on which they offered sacrifices to God. Now they were home, dead center, on the very ground where God had promised Abraham, "To you and to your descendants I will give this land." A large, flat-faced rock stood like a huge tombstone right next to the green oak tree, life and death, side by side. On the face of the stone, Joshua instructed a mason to engrave the non-negotiable 10 commands. Joshua had them boost him up onto the rock to address the assembly. He stood there, leaning on his staff, face blackened by the sun, skin wrinkled with age, wispy white hair blowing in the wind. A great silence settled over the valley. "I set before you this day life and death, blessing and cursing. Choose life." Turning to those on the lifeless slopes of Mount Ebal, Joshua recited a horrifying catalogue of woes that would befall those who might ever dare to disregard the law of God. There was shocked silence when he'd finished. Then, turning to those on the lush green slopes of Mount Gerizim, he promised a plethora of blessings that beggared the imagination. "All these will be the inheritance of those who obey these commands." Then from either side of the valley echoed a thunderous agreement of 1,000,000 voices, promising obedience. When the echoes died away to silence, "Your forefathers worshipped so-called gods in the land way beyond the Euphrates. The Egyptians worshipped the gods of the Nile. The inhabitants of this land worshipped all manner of deities. But it was the Lord God who brought you miraculously to this place. Choose then today whom you will serve, but I and my family, we will serve the Lord." Again, thunderous agreement. "But no," Joshua countered as the roar once again died away to stillness. "You cannot say that you'll serve the Lord and then later change your minds." "Aye, but we'll never change our minds. We're determined to serve the Lord." "You'll hold each other accountable for this decision?" "Absolutely." "Then destroy the idols and so-called art that you have among your plunder. Turn your hearts fully to the Lord." "Yes," they bellowed, "we will serve the Lord our God and we'll obey him completely." When the echoes of their determination had faded and silence again settled in that valley of decision, Joshua spoke one last time. Standing on the stone that spelled out the absolutes of God's standards, there in the shade of the oak tree of life. "This stone has heard your words, and will forever stand as witness to your promise." From there they all drifted back in 1,000 directions to start a whole new life as a nation in their own homes, on their own farms, in their own towns, tribe by tribe, living proof that God keeps his promises. Not long after, Joshua died and was buried on his farm in Timnath-Serah.